Hi, this is Michelle Grove speaking. I'm going to read and do a little bit of education around the birth stories of Jesus as the Christ child. Many of our congregations will be celebrating Christmas Eve services, and these stories, or at least some of these stories, will be read. And how wonderful it is when we have a better understanding of where they came from. You see, these stories were written 2,000 years ago. And the audience in which they were written for, and the author of these stories had very different life situations than we might live in today. And so with this, it's better to understand where they were coming from so that we can fully understand the story. So with that, hear this first story, which is Matthew 1:18-25. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew was writing specifically for a Jewish audience, trying very desperately to tie together this idea that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the one that we had been promised, with all the hundreds of thousands of years of sacred literature that came before this. So hear these stories. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but he had no marital relationships with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. So there are many things that are happening here that are important to know. Like I said, first of all, the author of this gospel is tying together the happenings and the story of Jesus with the Hebrew scriptures that had been written for about 1,000 years. They had actually been written down, but the oral tradition went on far beyond that. And through that tradition, the idea of Messiah started to appear, particularly from the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures. And so here is a writer saying, "My friends, he is here, and let me tell you the story so that you will believe just as I do." Now, there's a couple of very interesting things with this one, and it's interesting to compare this story with the one written in Luke, which we will do in just a moment. First of all, if you'll notice, all the action is around Joseph. Mary is a passive person who is named, but has no action within this narrative. Now, that might sound patriarchal, and it is. But one of the things to know is that reading any of these stories without understanding the full context is a dangerous thing. In this case, reading the story without reading the first part of the chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, you will see a genealogy in which the writer connects Jesus to the holy line of David. And that whole line is a patriarchal line. The Jewish people followed the heritage of each person and their lineage through the man. And yet, this is where this author actually might be a feminist, because he does something pretty amazing at this point. And that is he names or refers to 5 women within the lineage. That was unheard of. If you read all the other lineages within the Hebrew scriptures, they are all through the male lineage. And yet, in the Gospel of Matthew, Mary and 4 other women are named, or at least identified, if not by name. It's easy to recognize exactly who they are. So with that, yes, it's true. This is through Joseph. But just remember, before that, we actually had the naming of Mary in a lineage that never has a woman named. Now, some of the other things that are really important to note here. This book is suspected by scholars to have been written somewhere between 80 and 90 CE. This would have been after the Gospel of Mark was written, and the Gospel of Mark would have been widely kind of publicized and passed around to different early Christian churches. So it is likely that this author had already read the book of Mark. So with that, understand the context. The Jewish people are under Roman rule. When Jesus was living, it was oppressive, but it wasn't horrible. But when the Gospel of Matthew was written, it was starting to get bad, and the oppression was getting worse and worse. The rights of the Jewish people were being squeezed out, and their needing to hold on to their land and their identity was being shaken. For example, in 72 CE, a cornerstone, a major cornerstone of their faith and their religious identity was destroyed, and that was the temple. So this was written after that time. So you can imagine how shaken they might have felt. So remember that as you hear this story. The other thing, and this is different from the story that we're going to hear in Luke, the writer says that the baby was born of the Holy Spirit. So this is a place where the concept of the Trinity is introduced, the Holy Spirit. That's an interesting thing to note and to remember. Here's the other thing. In this culture 2,000 years ago, if a woman committed adultery, there were 2 forms of action that the man could take: divorce or turning her over to authorities so that she could be stoned to death. Joseph did not want to do either of those. He wanted just to kind of let it go away. So he was going to try to just kind of be quiet about it and see if there was a way to kind of slip, out of that. Because his line was, let me find it here. Oh, yes. Being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, he planned to dismiss her quietly. So yeah, he was going to divorce her, but not to make a public appeal, and try to do it as quietly as possible. And that's when the angel came to him, according to the story. He also, here's the other important part. He says, Joseph, son of David, because tying the birth of Jesus to the line of David is crucial, because it is the line of David in which the Messiah has been foretold to come. That is why it was important for Joseph, who was of the lineage of David, to be the father. And so this story is basically saying Joseph knew he wasn't the father. The Holy Spirit was the father, but Joseph adopted him as his own son. And therefore Jesus became a part of that lineage. And that way then the foretelling of the Messiah and the connection of that to Jesus is true. There's so much more we could talk about, but that might be enough to at least wet your whistle and to think about it some more. I will continue these in other videos, but for this time, thank you and have an amazing day and a good holiday.